Well, thank you for attending my presentation here by video on natural hazard versus natural disaster designation in the United States, how small differences in terminology can lead to large differences in coastal management policy. In terms of an overview, it's important to understand the difference between how in the United States and very likely in other countries, they distinguish between natural hazards and natural disasters. In the United States, a natural hazard is any event that causes damage, a flood, a hurricane, a volcano eruption, etc., things that we would normally look at and see as natural. A natural disaster is a political designation. And the importance of that political designation is that when a natural disaster is declared via some sort of natural event, normally something we would define as a natural hazard, then there's financial and other resources that are released by both local, state, and importantly, the federal government in the United States to deal with the impacts and effects of that natural hazard, that event. The terminology matters because the United States has a long history of providing assistance to those who are harmed by events, so long as, conditionally, they're deemed not to be caused by humans generally, and they're deemed not to be at the fault of the human seeking assistance. An example would be in the United States and certainly in other countries, a historical recalcitrance to provide aid for economic recessions. We can just go back to the 2008 economic recession and think about how countries had a difficult time dealing with that, the effects, the financial effects of that recession and the sort of trickle-down effects on the economy and those that suffered, individual citizens of countries that suffered, and the recalcitrance that the government had in stepping in and providing a lot of assistance in terms of relief that made it down all the way down to those that were ultimately individually affected. It's very different in the United States when it comes to something that it sees or perceives as a natural hazard or a natural disaster. And the problem for policymakers is these federal subsidies for coastal disasters. When coastal disasters occur in the United States, they're declared natural disasters and it releases a whole flood, pun unintended, of both financial and other support mechanisms. And historically, that derives from an assumption of no fault. In other words, these sort of federal subsidies are directly related to the notion that, these natural disasters are just that, they're natural, they're outside of human intervention. And of course, climate change policy has to internalize the effect that humans are having on these natural events, that climate change is having and human interaction vis-a-vis causing climate change is having on these hazards. And without doing that, it makes it very hard to fundamentally change human behaviors. It allows them to continue risk-seeking behaviors. And in the United States, the example, and in other countries as well, is to continue to invest and reinvest in dangerous coastal areas that are already low-lying and subject to the effects of climate change. In the United States, this is obvious. If we look at population centers, here's the northeastern portion of the United States as an example. It's highly densely populated along coastal regions. Most of the population exists, and this is throughout the entire country of the United States. Most of the country is concentrated, the population is concentrated in coastal areas. And many of these coastal areas with the highest concentrations of population are very low-lying and are in areas that are considered to be subject to flooding under existing conditions and are also experiencing disproportionate effects of observed sea level rise. That's not unique to the United States, for example. In terms of global populations, many population centers across the globe are concentrated in coastal areas. And based on some of the most recent research, many of these global cities will experience disproportionate effects financially. And on the left, you can see in terms of projected financial costs of the high-end scenario of the International Panel on Climate Change's forecasting of the effects of climate change, in particular sea level rise. And here you'll see the effects here on the left. And the OECD has also done its own sort of analysis in terms of what's going on with OECD countries what are they doing in terms of looking at, from a policy standpoint, the effects of climate change and in particular coastal flooding and sea level rise management in these nations? And what sort of preparation? Is it just information provision, or is it moving to other more important things? And you can see down at the bottom, the United States really is, like many other countries, it's in sort of nascent stages. It's in an information building stage, not really in an action stage. And that just reinforces sort of the difficulties that I'm talking about here in terms of federal disaster relief related to the nomenclature of our disaster policy here in the United States of providing relief and support when we see things as natural, and then the effect that has on the human psyche and human behavior patterns at the aggregate level. Sort of a precondition in USA policy to explain that sort of habit forming in more detail is that we in the United States have a long history of paying for disasters, including coastal damages. We see them as natural or beyond human direct action, and therefore we've simply historically paid for them. And when government pays, it effectively states, this is not your fault. That's effectively what it's saying, because our government in the United States does not pay for things that it deems to be related to human activities, even if it's not the individual's fault. Sort of all of those traditional, caveat emptor, buyer beware, homeowners in 2008, 2009, 2010, who lost significant value in their homes and were upside down on their mortgages. They weren't really helped out by the United States government. Those who lost jobs as a result, so on and so forth. They really weren't helped out. It was sort of that's your responsibility. You should have known, you should have thought about it. That doesn't really happen when it comes to, for example, losses of homes that are built and developed in a significant flood hazard zone in the United States. There's a coastal storm, it comes, it destroys the home, significantly damages the home. There really isn't that same attitude where, well, that's, buyer beware, you should have thought about that. And it makes it difficult because then the government steps in, it provides a lot of financial resources, effectively providing support mechanisms and financial resources to develop and redevelop the area. And that just tells the homeowner, and not just at the individual level, but at the aggregate level, it says that, look, this is not your fault. And if it happens, we're going to step in and we're going to make you whole. Instead of you being responsible for that risk. And in a world where climate change is causing that risk to increase over time, particularly with sea level rise, it's really difficult to think about how that policy structure leads to people really internalizing that risks. So those payments to make whole reduce the perception of risk, which increases an appetite for risk, coastal development, home ownership, etc. And the amount of harm, the cost, is increasing in both what is expected and what actually occurs. We can see that on the right here, and we see controlled for 2020 fiscal year dollars. So you're looking at an apples to apples comparison from fiscal year 1964 all the way through fiscal year 2020, what the United States budgeted, and that's in this sort of yellow or gold, the annual budget appropriation, what it budgeted for disaster relief, financial disaster relief allocations, and what it actually had to spend. And you'll see that in some years on the large version of the graph, we can't even see because the spending was so high in the supplemental appropriations, which are in the blue, that you have to look at the inset to see exactly where that goes. But what you can see clearly is that in the early days of federal, after the National Flood Insurance Program, 1964, basically, when the federal government got into subsidizing federal public insurance for coastal areas, flood insurance for coastal areas in the United States. Since 1964, the appropriations, relatively speaking, are close to or meet what actual needs are for a number of years. But as you can see, as time goes on, you see the appropriations are woefully inadequate relative to what is actually needed based on the actual damages incurred, the disasters that are happening. And this correlates closely with our climate change. It correlates closely with CO2 level increases and what we've observed in terms of climate variability and frequency, intensity of storms over time. So we see that disasters are happening more often. The risk is increasing in terms of financial, as the amount of money being spent on these disasters as a proxy for determining risk. We can see that's increasing over time. And you can see that finally, starting in about fiscal year 2012, 2013, to some degree, the federal government starts appropriating a lot more money. It's trying to internalize the reality of all of that blue shading that we saw from about 1992 to about 2008, it's starting to appropriate more funds, but that doesn't mean that those funds are actually meeting the mark. You can see that there's still significant additional appropriations that are happening even in the latter years. Point being there is that the risk is obviously increasing. The federal government is paying way more than it intends to pay or that it hopes it has to pay. And that is just reinforcing this sort of cycle of, well, you know what, this is outside of human control, so it's okay, it's not your fault, we're going to take care of it. There's a whole slew of additional added complexities related to trying to internalize the risks, the increasing risks in coastal areas, because there's significant public subsidies, there's a huge amount of amenity value, and there's a lot of capital investment and entire systems, financial networks in the United States that are entirely dependent on sort of what we call disaster economics. And all of these sort of meld together. It's something I can't go into great detail because of time restrictions, but they all meld together and create a really, really complex scenario of a sort of policy conundrum in order to try to think about what does this do, in fact, in trying to prevent, you know, the next disaster from occurring, and what does it do in terms of internalizing risk into the mindset of those individuals and groups that are investing and reinvesting in coastal areas. And the answer is, as you could see from the previous, not too much. It actually incentivizes that taking on of risk, especially when the risk can be passed off to the government agency. Really quickly, just to understand, in terms of natural, when we think about from natural disaster or natural hazard, what's natural about climate change? What's important here in A, B, and C is that in A, you see natural influences, and you see them relative to the observed changes in temperature. So you see all of the sort of natural influences that would raise the temperature, global average temperatures, and you see the observed global average temperatures. In B, you see all of the human influences, particularly the red, all human drivers, sort of, you know, all of the different drivers there, aerosols, land cover, et cetera, and greenhouse gases, but all sort of average together as the red line, and how that matches the black observed. And then when you combine natural and human drivers, you see all, but it's clear that human activity is really driving climate change. So it's not something that's outside of human control, and it's not something that we would historically see as something of no fault of human beings. This is the kind of thing, like an economic, financial crisis, that at least the United States would co-opt into this idea that, well, there's more human responsibility here. The government's going to be recalcitrant in providing just all kinds of levels of relief. That would be, so climate change would naturally fit into that narrative, although it doesn't, and it currently doesn't. So this idea of matching fault to policy goals. We currently assume harm associated with climate change is natural when dealing with the effects of that harm. That's the disaster relief, implicit and explicit subsidies, et cetera, in the United States. These assumptions misdirect resources. We have develop, redevelop, and protect increasingly dangerous areas. And they also reinforce public expectations in two important ways. They extend a narrative that climate-related harm is natural, and they incentivize externalizing the harm and thus the risk. Ultimately, this inhibits adoption of direct climate change policies that attempt to internalize risk. It creates that kind of moral hazard, to use a term that was really pushed around, at least here in the United States, but also globally, during the economic crisis of 2008, 2009. That sort of heads I win, tails you lose. Excuse me, that says tails I lose, but tails you lose. It creates a gain framing perspective. The idea there is that, you know, all I can do is win here. So if I choose to develop a home in a coastal area that's low-lying, first of all, its amenity value is going to be high. People are going to want to buy that, so it's going to retain its value. Second is, even if it's in a dangerous area, I really don't have to internalize the risk of that danger, because if something bad does happen, the federal government and the state and local governments are going to step in and they're going to provide me with all kinds of relief. So from an investment perspective, it makes a lot of sense for me to do this. And I can do it in a significantly subsidized way, because that relief effectively is like insurance that I don't have to pay for. Therefore, I don't have to internalize the risk of loss. Really what it comes down to. So as a solution, you know, the simple way of saying it is, at least in the United States, but I'm sure in other countries as well, the policies that we have are effectively saying that, you know, it's natural that the types of things that we're seeing, climate change, sea level rise, it's outside of human influence. It's not directly related to human activities. And, you know, that's effectively what we're saying, our policies are saying. And of course, what they have to say is no, that the human influences are really the direct drivers of these things. And therefore, we have to take actions, even when those actions are difficult. to try to mitigate not only the effects and the damage today, but also looking forward. Instead of reinvesting and overinvesting in dangerous areas that are only becoming more dangerous, we need to really think about pulling back from that kind of investment. And policy at the federal level really needs to lead the way in the United States. So that's my talk in 15 minutes. It would be great. There are so many questions that come from this, and I'm hoping that you'll bring great questions to the actual Q&A of this session, and I'd be happy to talk to you. Thank you so much.